Hey, it's Drybear. We've hit a lull in the Season 1 events of the First Descendant, so I wanted to check in to see where everyone was in their progression, whether they're new players just joining the game, or they're working their way through hard mode and everything in between. And I just put out a poll trying to figure out where the audience was, and this one was actually kind of shocking for me. It makes sense based on what I've been hearing people say and the experience in game, but today I want to talk a little bit about Gluttony, or Tony as I like to call him, and the difficulty that he creates and what's happening right now in the community. See, what I didn't expect is that for the majority of players, almost 80% of the players, over 80% of the players, have not cleared Gluttony, even if they've spent a large amount of hours. And I've spent some time talking to my community about why that might be and what their aversion is, and most people actually don't feel like it's even worth it. And a lot of people, even though they may have a build that is Gluttony worthy and capable of taking him out, just actively avoid the fight in general. And honestly, if I was on the Nexon team, I would find this to be extremely concerning. And you want the hardest boss in the game currently to feel like it's a big challenge step up. And you want people to be encouraged to make very well-made strategies and compositions that work well for the fight. And also you want that hard boss to have a lot of very interesting loot. You can only get Peacekeeper or Peacemaker from this fight. There are some specific amorphous that you want to build for it as well. But the fact that the majority of the community is actively avoiding Gluttony entirely is a huge red flag. Now, it doesn't mean that he's unbeatable. And let's talk about the strategies you can use to defeat Gluttony and also what's required to get things working and what the limitations are for this fight and why it's so dang hard to play in a public group setting. Now, and we also have to kind of give credit to the source of the game as well. This is a South Korean developer, and if you haven't played a lot of South Korean games, they are very elitist when it comes to difficulty in video games. Oftentimes in any South Korean game, you are liable to have a lot of raid, like instant raid wipes, instant fails, really high difficulty bars, or just kind of awkward things that they force you to get through, because ultimately in South Korea, there's a lot of internet cafe culture where people group up in large groups. They play these kind of games together when they have time off, and they'll do it in a public setting. It's almost like a super huge LAN party, and there's a lot of information sharing, grouping up, and working together. But when that usually works its way over into other cultures and other gaming communities, oftentimes there can be some friction with those kind of bars being set, especially when you're playing with random players that you don't know, that you just got forced into a match with. See, Gluttony has a few things that are competing for your attention and competing for what you're looking for as well. The first is going to be his absolutely massive high DPS bar. And yes, if you are someone who is a content creator like I am and you have a lot of time invested in the game, it's not hard to hit the DPS that you need in order to clear the DPS requirement to take Gluttony down. So it is possible to do so, but it's kind of unrealistic to expect your normal, everyday, casual gamer to get a build that can by themselves do the DPS required to hit Gluttony. Now, technically, you don't need to kill him in 2 phase cycles, but the longer you go, he has a soft enrage. And what this means is that the longer you go into the fight, the harder it gets, because the mechanic for the bubbles gets more and more difficult to complete as the AoEs start getting further and further away from where he is, which means it becomes untenable by around like the 3 or 4 minute mark, so you can't really use those final moments. The other major problem is the sheer amount of damage that he deals on top of it as well. This fight is not a fight that you can realistically outgear. You cannot get enough defense and enough HP and enough resistance and immunity to frostbite to the point where you can just face take him all the time unless you have literally 0 damage output. So finding enough damage in your build in order to meet the DPS check requirement while also having enough survivability to not constantly go down is a tall order, and for most players is practically impossible depending on how much time you've spent in the game. So what it does require you to do in this fight is you have to use your positioning, you have to use the environment to your advantage, as Raz Al Ghul used to say, be mindful of your surroundings. You have to use walls, break line of sight, make sure you know when you have aggro from Gluttony, and use that as an opportunity to stay safe, which for some characters can be easy, and for some it cannot be. If you're someone who has to be up close, or you're someone who locks themselves in place like Haley, or you just generally have low mobility, it can be tough to be in the right place at the right time to keep up with the amount of damage that he does, while also dealing doing enough damage to take him down. So not only does he have a soft enrage, he has a true enrage, he also does a crazy amount of damage and has a high DPS requirement. But because of all of these things put together, he also snowballs into really awkward situations like you see on screen. When one person goes down, it's very easy for another person to go down trying to save that person, and then it steamrolls and snowballs until it's all over and you have to reset. And this is an easy way to build up a lot of frustration for people. And that doesn't even cover the hard wipe mechanic that is worth talking about next, and that is these bubbles here. If you've never played against Gluttony, the mechanic here is very similar to Hanged Man. There is a meter that exists on his arm, his wrist bone, that will show how long until that meter gets filled up. So as he's going through the fight, as he's getting purple bubbles lining up with him, and as you're dealing damage to him, that meter is filling up. If that meter reaches maximum, it will wipe everyone in the party and kill everyone off, effectively being a hard wipe. The way you counter this mechanic is by being able to shoot the bubbles towards him. You shoot the bubbles towards him and land them on him, which will lower the meter, and there's also a mod that you can use for Valby that will collect all these bubbles together and shoot them over. However, the challenge is, as this fight goes further and further on, these pedestals that spawn bubbles get further and further away from the center, and also the bubbles move by default slower than the way Gluttony side strafes. So if you're far away, you have to lead them by quite a bit, and if he changes directions, you're going to miss, on top of everything else we just mentioned. So when you put all this together, he does a large amount of damage that you need to build properly for. He also requires a large amount of DPS that you need to build properly for. He also requires you to do the mechanic, and the forgiveness on that mechanic is very narrow. In fact, in public parties, I find that oftentimes when I'm playing in a random pug of 4, I will almost always just be on full-time bubble duty because we're just not getting enough bubbles on him before the hard wipe happens. And you also have people going down and lots of damage coming out, and I think overall leads to, I would say, a pretty poor, abysmal experience for most pug parties. And I think this also happened with Frostwalker as a boss as well. Was Frostwalker in his original form too hard? No. The problem was that you got pretty much exactly 6 or 7 of those little fire orbs, and you needed exactly 6, which means that the redundancy and the wiggle room inside of the mechanic was so narrow and precise that in pug parties it was completely unreasonable to expect a group of 4 randoms coming together to be able to do this on their own. And I think the same thing is true for Gluttony. To expect a random pug of 4 people that don't know each other to all be able to survive the damage that he does, to all meet the DPS requirement, while also all doing the bubble mechanic and keeping his meter low, while also handling his frenzy mechanic at the same time, is just unrealistic. This fight is built for a pre-made. And in fact, most of the parties that clear him now, what they do is they just go for a super stacked Enzo buff plus Sharon shred plus crazy DPS from pure DPS classes as their only primary, and they try to 1 or 2 cycle him without even doing his mechanics at all. And I think for the same reason that they are nerfing some of the mechanics that are causing people to quit the game, I think they need to rethink a little bit on how they introduce these new encounters. Making them so tight on requirements that only really a pre-made can do it consistently, I think is not a healthy thing for the game, and that's not something that will encourage pugs. And honestly, if we're actually at a point where the vast majority of the players, even players that are well equipped, well prepared, and ready to do Gluttony, are actively avoiding the encounter, I think that is not a healthy thing for the game and something that needs to be addressed going forward. I think it's perfectly fine to have a DPS check. I think it's perfectly fine to have a high damage check that you require enough HP, enough defense, and possibly even frostbite immunity to make it all work, and the planning that goes into that. But I think to do that with a hard wipe in the fight on top of a very strict requirement on the resource generation on the bubbles being very uptime reliant, very focused reliant. You need basically 1 or 2 Valbies full time on the bubbles to keep it down, or everyone needs to be contributing on bubbles the entire time, which kind of competes with their time for doing damage on Gluttony in general. So I think all the requirements of the fight are so tight and so narrow that it's kind of built for a pre-made, not built for a pug. And I think when they fixed the Frostwalker fight by allowing more of those fire orbs to drop, it meant there was redundancy built into the fight, which meant that when pugs make mistakes, because they will, there's enough extra fire orbs for 1 or 2 people to do the mechanic properly and save the day and get the boss down. And now I think Frostwalker is a lot easier to pug for it. So making the boss difficult versus making the boss uncomfortable and irritating, or also just very, very poorly built for random pugs, is something that needs to be addressed going forward. But let me know what your thoughts are down below. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.